In this lesson, we're going to talk about plot and plot diagrams. Plot is the organized pattern or sequence of events that make up a story. Every plot is made up of a series of incidences that are related to one another. Most stories follow the same sequence of events, and as the character moves through the story, he or she grows and develops. Here are the sequence of events. First, the exposition. This usually occurs at the beginning of the story. Here the characters are introduced. We also learn about the setting, and most importantly, we learn about the main problem or conflict in the story. Then we have the rising action. The rising action is part of the story that begins the conflict or conflicts. A building of interest or suspense occurs, and everything that's happening leads up to the climax. The third part is the climax or turning point. This is usually when the main character, or protagonist, sometimes we call them, comes face to face with a conflict. The main character will change in some way as a result of this. At this point of the story moves from building conflict to resolving conflict. It is not necessarily the most exciting part of the story, but oftentimes it is. Then we have the falling action. Everything that happens as a result of the climax happens in the falling action. All the loose ends of the plot are tied up, and the conflict or conflicts and the climate are taken care of. Then we have the final part of the plot, the resolution or denouncement. This is the part of the story that sums up or brings the conflicts to a resolution or conclusion. It should be believable and not a huge surprise because the plot should have been building up to this point at the end of the story. So when we talk about plot, we talk about a plot diagram. So this is what the plot diagram looks like. You have your exposition down here, what happens at the beginning of the story. Then we move up the diagram to the rising action, what leads to the main problem or conflict. At the top of the diagram, we have the climax, which is this turning point. What happens when the problem or conflict reaches the highest point? And then as we move down, this is the following action. Okay? How is the problem or conflict solved? And at the end, we have the resolution. How did the story conclude? To help us understand plot diagram, I've decided to read to you Where the Wild Things Are. The night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind and another. His mother called him Wild Thing, and Max said, "I'll eat you up." And so he was sent to bed without anything. That very night in Max's room, a forest grew and grew and grew until his ceiling hung with vines and the walls became the world around him. And an ocean tumbled both a private boat for Max, and he sailed off through the night and day, and in and out of weeks and almost a year to where the wild things are. And when he came to the place where the wild things are, they roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth, and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws. Till Max said, "Be still," and tame them with a magic trick, and staring at their yellow eyes without blinking once, and they were frightened and called him the most wild thing of all, and made him king of all the wild things. "And now," cried Max, "let the wild rumpus start." "Now stop," Max said, and he sent the wild things off to bed without their supper. And Max, the king of all wild things, was lonely and wanted to be where someone loved him best of all. Then all around from far away across the world, he smelled good things to eat. So he gave up being king to where the wild things are. But the wild things cried, "Oh, please don't go, and we'll eat you up now. We love you so." And Max said, "No." The wild things roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws, but Max stepped into his private boat and waved goodbye, and sailed back over a year and in and out of weeks and through a day, and into the night of his very own room, where he found his supper waiting for him. And it was still hot. So taking the story Where the Wild Things Are, we're now going to complete a plot diagram for where the wild things are. So the exposition, the beginning of the story. In the beginning of Where the Wild Things Are, Max wore his wolf suit and made trouble. He was sassy with his mom and was sent to bed without dinner. As the story continues, the rising action builds. A forest grew in Max's room. Max sailed to where the wild things are. He met and became king of the wild things, and he told the wild things to be still, and they listened. The climax, or the turning point in the story, is when Max and the wild things had a rumpus. And then the following action, Max stomped the rumpus and sent the wild things to bed without supper, and Max wished he was where someone loved him most of all. He then smelled good food, and he gave up being king and sailed home. In the end of the story, or the resolution, Max returned to his home and found his hot dinner waiting for him. So this is an example of a plot diagram of for the short story, Where the Wild Things Are.